Thank you very much, Mauricio. It's a pleasure to be back here at the Business Center to share some ideas and what's happening and going on in Brazil. Just to explain my 1962 Brazil contact, I was in the first Fiscal group that went to Brazil in 1962 to work with Rural Extension and their version of 4-H Club. So I arrived in Rio in March of 1962, and Tancredo Neves was still Prime Minister under the parliamentary system. My wife and I were married in '64 and we came back to the US, but then we ended up at the University of Brasilia, where I've been teaching since 1972. So it's been a long haul to interact with Brazil. Well, what we're going to try to do today is to look at these highly polarized elections that we had in October, and what are the next steps, what's going on now for 2019. Well, this was a big game changer election. Really what happened? We had two big waves of public opinion. First there was a wave of anti-Lula and anti-PT, and then there was another wave of public opinion that was alienation and disgust with a very corrupt political system. Many people said to the interviewers, all politicians are corrupt. I won't vote to re-elect anyone. I'm going to search for a new, clean face. So Bolsonaro incorporated both of these currents of opinion into his campaign and operated as the anti-system candidate. Now the anti-system president-elect is going to have to operate within the system. Ever since '94, the presidential elections were polarized between the PT and the PSDB. But in 2018, the PSDB in the center literally disappeared. Alckmin, PSDB, Marina Silva, etc. Marina Silva, in the previous two elections, 2010 and 14, she got 20% of the vote. She came up with less than 1% this year. So this turned out to be a left-right polarization of PT versus Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro used a digital campaign very, very efficiently. Social networks and social media. And he had been working on this ever since 2015-16. So by 2018, he had a whole network of supporters, maybe 4, 5, 6 million supporters already articulated via internet. And so, so this was a campaign where he used the internet and the social media very extensively. Well, let's look at what happened. Sort of a sequence of events here in 2018. In January, Judge Sergio Moro, who's now going to be the new Minister of Justice, convicted Lula. And in April, the TRF4, the regional federal court in Porto Alegre, maintained Lula's conviction, but actually increased his sentence. So on April 7th, Lula was arrested and imprisoned in the federal police lockup in Curitiba, where he still is. In August, Lula stubbornly maintained his candidacy. The PT officially registered Lula as a presidential candidate, with Fernando Haddad as his vice president. On September 6th, Bolsonaro suffered a very bad knife attack in Juiz de Fora, nearly died. His life was saved by doctors at the Juiz de Fora hospital. So, he was not able to do any more street campaigning and not participate in any more TV debates. On September 9th, the TSE, our National Election Court, rejected Lula's candidacy. Now my question is, where was, somewhere else in some other presidential election throughout the world, in the presidential system, where was a prisoner ever a presidential candidate? Do any of you know where there was a prisoner?
I wrote to tell you that.
You did, right? Yeah. Eugene Debs. You all know who Eugene Debs is, right?
For the U.S., right?
Yeah, U.S. He was a leader of the Socialist Party. But he ran for president in 1920 while he was still in prison. Well, why was he in prison? Because he publicly spoke out against World War I and against the U.S. participation in World War I. Back then that was called sedition. And so he got put into jail. Well, when the next president was elected in 2020, was Harding, right? He pardoned him. So, yeah, so he was released from jail. So he remembered that there was a precedent. Eugene Debs, okay. On September 11th, the PT then launched Haddad as a presidential candidate, got the message from the election court, and Manuel Dávila from the PCdoB became the vice presidential running mate with Haddad. Now, I'm sure all of you know who Haddad is. He was Lula's choice. In Mexico, they call it a dedazo. Lula's choice as a PT candidate for mayor of Sao Paulo in 2012. So with a little help from Paulo Maluf, Haddad got elected mayor of Sao Paulo in 2012. But he ran for re-election in 2016 and was wiped out by João Dória, who won on the first round. Never before had anyone been elected mayor of Sao Paulo in the first round. So now Haddad again becomes Lula's dedazo. And in Brazil, they call him the post, because Lula glorified himself saying, I can elect any post in this country. So Haddad again was Lula's post. And there was not unanimous opinion within the PT that this Lula's choice or Lula's imposition was really the right candidate. But this left him with only less than 30 days to campaign before the October 7th first round election. So this is the Datafolha polls before the first round on October 7th. So as you can see, in the Datafolha poll back on the 2nd of August, Lula was already in jail, but he polled 39%. But then, of course, you can see he no longer got into the poll because it was obvious that he was not going to be a candidate. So you can see that Bolsonaro gradually increased up to 36% in the 6th of October, which was equivalent to 40% of the valid vote. And so he then polled finally 46.05 of the valid vote, and Haddad came in 29.26. So at that point, the spread was 16.8 points between the first and second candidate. Ciro Gomes ended up with 13% at the end. And Alckmin in the poll 7, but with the valid vote only 4.76. And as I said before, Marina Silva ended up with only 1% of the valid vote. So that's the first round. Now, the second round simulation is done by Datafolha. I use Datafolha because I consider it to be the best poll in Brazil, the most accurate. So as you can see, Bolsonaro had 46% of the valid vote, and then went on 49, 50, 48, 47, and ended up with 55% of the valid vote. Haddad ended up with 44.9% of the valid vote, about 11-point spread difference between the two toward the end. But as you can see, I put in what the Datafolha read their rejection rates. And actually Bolsonaro had a larger rejection rate, 45%, as you can see, but Haddad's rejection rate was even higher. It was 52%. And toward the last end, Bolsonaro's rejection rate was up 1 point, and Haddad's rejection rate was down 1 point. This is the party composition in the Chamber of Deputies, where we had, now this year, we had 26 parties, and 30 parties elected at least one deputy. However, that may be reduced to 21 parties because we had, as you can see here, 9 parties did not surpass the performance clause, and their deputies probably will migrate to some other larger parties. So Bolsonaro's party, the PSL, may acquire another 10 or 12 deputies. This performance clause is not really a rejection clause, because in Germany that began this back in 1949, 5%. In Germany you don't get 5% of the valid vote, you don't elect anybody. That's it. But this is a performance clause that says if your party did not get 1.5% of the valid vote, your deputies will be seated. But you can see the asterisks there of these 9 parties. Your party will not have any money from the party fund, and your party will not have access to the free TV propaganda time twice a year. So no TV and no money, that's enough to kill almost any party. So you can see the PT elected 56 deputies, down from 62. And Bolsonaro's party over here, you can see the PSL, elected only 1 deputy back in 2014, but in 2018 had 8. and then elected 52. But as you can see with the hashtag down here, the PSL should have elected 59 deputies. But this law that was passed in 2015, which was a law against what we call locomotives, candidates for deputy who get a huge number of votes and then pull other people in with them, like Chididika did in 2010 and 2014. So it says this law.
Is it the case with Novo?
Hey?
Novo,
Yeah, the Novo Party, right. Novo did,
0 to 8.
yes. Well, Novo elected 8 deputies, but they had more than 1.5% of the valid votes, so they don't have an asterisk. So this said that to be elected deputy, you're going to have at least 10% of the election quotient. So the PSL, Bolsonaro's party, had 2 locomotives. His son, Eduardo, got 1.8 million votes for deputy in São Paulo. And Joyce Hasselman got 1.2, I think, million votes. So they should have pulled in another 7 deputies. But these 7 deputies didn't meet this criteria of having 10% of the election quotient. So should have elected, instead of 52, his party should have elected 59. Now, as you can see, Bolsonaro's coattails is an expression here in American politics. Bolsonaro's coattails were quite strong. Pulled in all these deputies elected by him, was elected 4 governors from his own party, and several senators as well. So Bolsonaro's coattails were very, very strong in this election. This is the Senate party composition. We have currently 17 parties in the Senate. But we should have, now we do now have 21 would be represented in the Senate. However, we have 6 parties that didn't surpass this performance clause barrier in the chamber. And perhaps some of these senators elected by these parties might switch and join some other parties, perhaps. As you can see, Marina Silva's party did fairly well, elected 5 senators, only had 1. But I forgot to really show you here in the Chamber of Deputies, some of the larger important parties got reduced. You can see the PT got reduced down by 6 deputies. The MDB got reduced by 16 deputies. The PSDB got shrunk down by 20 deputies to a very small, a medium-sized party. The PP was shrunk, and the Democrats also were shrunk. So you can see some of the larger, major traditional parties got shrunk in the chamber. They also got shrunk in the Senate. MDB lost 6 senators. The PSDB lost 4. The PT lost 3. And so you can see that the shrinkage also occurred in the Senate. We had considerable turnover in the Congress. Now turnover means new faces, new blood, freshmen coming in. We had 54 seats up for elections in the Senate, 2 per state. 32 senators ran for re-election, but only 10 got re-elected. And we had 44 newcomers, and that was almost 82% turnover. The traditional parties were reduced, as I said before, the MDB, the PSDB, the PT, and the PR. Other parties increased, as you can see. PSD increased from 5 to 7, the Hedgie from 1 to 5. But as I said before, 12 of these senators might migrate, so we'll have to wait and see in February whether they're going to migrate to some other parties. We also had many prominent senators who were defeated. Homero Jucá, a very important senator from the state of Roraima, got defeated. Eunice Oliveira, who is the current president of the Senate from Ceará, MDB, he also got defeated. Roberto Requião from Paraná got defeated. Our former dear rector of the University of Brasilia, Cristóvão Duarte, got defeated in Brasilia. Magno Malta and Ricardo Ferraço, both from Espírito Santo, were defeated. Lindbergh Faria from Rio, PT, defeated. Edson Lobão, one of the Sarney group, was defeated in Maranhão. The whole Sarney family was wiped out in this election. Cássio Cunha Lima, who's been a senator for a number of years, from Paraíba, was defeated. And Jorge Viana, the PT from Acre, was defeated. So the Viana family has more or less dominated Acre politics for more than 20 years. And so they were wiped out, and their candidate for governor was defeated. 2 former PSDB governors were defeated for the Senate. Beto Richa from Paraná was defeated, and Marconi Perillo from Goiás, both accused of corruption. Beto Richa was worse because the corruption accusation put him in jail for 3 or 4 days. So this destroyed their Senate campaigns. Chamber of Deputies, all 513 seats were up for election. 52% turnover, 52% newcomers. Women increased their size in the Chamber of Deputies from 53 to 75. 75 is now 15% of the chamber are women. One Indian woman was elected from Rondônia. Traditional parties were reduced, as you saw. PT reduced, MDB, PSDB, PP, Dems, and also PR. Other parties increased. As I said before, Bolsonaro's party increased from 8 deputies to 52. The PDT, Ciro Gomes' party, also increased. The PRB, which is the evangelicals, the party of the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, increased. PSB, the Socialist Party, also had an increase. PSOL increased. PSOL was a split-off rival kicked out of the PT back in 2003, as you probably know. And the Solidariedade, the SD, also increased. As I said before, the PRB has evangelical deputies related to the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. The president-elect, Jair Messias Bolsonaro. Now, Messias, you know what that is, right? The Messiah. His mother gave him this name. Now begins organizing his new government. The anti-system candidate must now operate and govern within, quotes, the system. He's trying to reduce his cabinet ministers from the current 29 to maybe 15, 16, some now say perhaps 18. The same thing that Fernando Collor did back in 1990. He reduced the cabinet ministry to 12. So we're going to eliminate some ministries and combine others into super ministries. Reduce the number of federal political appointments, and trying to organize congressional relations to have a strong support coalition. We'll have to wait and see how that plays out after the new Congress takes office on the 1st of February. Now, this is how the cabinet looks right now. Only a few people have been really indicated as the new ministers. Casa Civil is Deputy Onyx Lorenzoni from Rio Grande do Sul. Economy is now a super ministry. Finance, Planning, and MDIC, the Development, Industry, and Commerce. Paulo Guedes is going to be that super minister. Defense has not been yet chosen, but the vice president, General Mourão, has said probably the defense minister will come from the Navy. Let's give the Navy a chance. Justice minister. Now this is a super ministry. It's going to be justice, the internal control, CGU, transparency, public security, and COAFI. COAFI looks at suspicious bank transfers and tries to fight corruption that way. So Sergio Moro, Judge Sergio Moro, who had been the Lava Jato judge in Curitiba, was picked by Bolsonaro to be the justice minister. Now, as you might imagine, that created a lot of opinions pro and contra to Moro. Of course, the PT is very contra because they think he was very partial and convicted all the PT people and put them in jail. But he did, but he convicted a lot of people from the MDB, from the PTB, from the PP as well, and put them in jail as well. So it wasn't just the PT. Infrastructure, another huge ministry. Mines and energy, perhaps as you can see in the last line, mines and energy might be separated out and remain a separate ministry. We're not sure. Transportation, urban mobility, sanitation, and telecommunications. Now that minister has already been chosen, General Osvaldo Ferreira. Science, technology, and higher education, removed from the Ministry of Education. This is going to be the Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Marcos Pontes, who is the first and only Brazilian astronaut ever gone into space with NASA. My wife's nephew said, he's a Nazista. from NASA, right? I'll play on words. So education is going to go back together with culture and sports. It used to be education had all these two together in education. Agriculture, initially it was said that agriculture and environment would be together in one new ministry. But both the agricultural interests and the environment people said no way. So they're going to remain separate. Health, not chosen yet, although several names are floating around. For education, there's several names floating around as well, but no one chose it. Foreign relations.
Graça Lima.
Yes, supposedly yes. It's supposedly going to be a diplomat. But Bolsonaro said, I'm going to take ideology out of foreign relations. So the new minister will neither represent the right nor the left. The new minister is going to be neutral, and all foreign policy is going to be no ideology. Bolsonaro also said, I'm probably going to close down several embassies that Lula created back in the early 2000s that are, he didn't use the word useless, he used the word ocioso, sort of left over and not really important. So he may reduce some of the embassies in some countries to being only a consulate type representation. Institutional security will be General Augusto Heleno, who is one of the more intelligent generals related to Bolsonaro. He was the general that commanded the peace force, the UN peacekeeping force in Haiti for a while. Social development and human rights, no one chosen yet. National integration, which will have tourism and cities together, and mines and energy. Now there may be some other ministries. As I said before, Magno Malta, a senator from the Espírito Santo, was defeated. And he's a very, very strong Bolsonaro supporter. He's also an evangelical. So there are rumors floating around that Bolsonaro might create the Ministry of the Family and give this ministry to Magno Malta. No one knows, really. These ministerial cabinet positions probably will be filled or indicated by the end of November. So maybe another 2 or 3 weeks to see. This list will be filled out. Judge Sergio Moro was the 13th Federal Circuit Judge in Curitiba and presided over the Lava Jato corruption investigation. Convicted many politicians, not only the PT, but MDB, PTB, PT, PP, PR, etc. He convicted Lula, as we saw before, in January 2018. Bolsonaro said, Moro has full powers to combat corruption and organized crime. This appointment was criticized by some, especially the PT, but Moro said, that means that I'm doing a good job. The criticism indicates that I'm doing a good job. He resigned his judgeship at the age of 44, and he's on vacation now, and his vacation will end more or less Christmas time. And so Bolsonaro might end up appointing him to the Supreme Court in 2020 when the next Supreme Court vacancy appears. Now some people in Brazil say that he may be a prime candidate for president in 2022. We don't know. Bolsonaro has said, I will not run for re-election. So we don't know whether that promise will be fulfilled or not. But there are people in Brazil who said this judge, if he does a good job in his super ministry position, justice ministry, might be a prime candidate for president. Moro's temporary substitute is Judge Gabriela Hart, who is considered a very, very hardline judge. And she actually convicted and sentenced José Dirceu to prison. So she is now occupying this judgeship until the regional court in Porto Alegre chooses a definite final substitution for Moro. It might be her, we don't know. So there's Judge Sergio Moro and President Bolsonaro. This was considered one of the most important appointments that he has made. Foreign affairs. Paulo Guedes is going to be the new, he's a Chicago boy economist. He's going to be the new economy minister. He dissed or disdained Argentina in a press conference by saying, Mercosur has very, very low priority. Then he had some questions from this Argentine journalist, and he dissed her as well. Not very good political smarts. He doesn't have those. First foreign visits are going to be Chile, US, and Israel. Why Israel? Bolsonaro has hinted that he might follow Trump's lead and transfer the Brazilian embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Perhaps.
Why Chile? Why Chile?
Good question. Another diss for Argentina. Well, Chile has a conservative companion, a conservative president. So he considers Chile to be sort of in our ballpark. That's more or less. Now, Bolsonaro has been very negative on China, saying they're buying up all these electrical installations and facilities. and buying up all these Brazilian lands. Bolsonaro, on a trip that he made to Asia as a free candidate, visited Taiwan, which of course was very offensive to mainland China. But now China has issued a cooperation statement saying we hope that cooperation between China and Brazil will continue and increase. Why? Because China is Brazil's largest trading partner. If you put exports and imports together, 4 or 5 years ago, China surpassed the U.S. as Brazil's #1 trading partner. U.S. is #2 and Argentina is #3. Now, you might transfer the embassy to Jerusalem, and this has created a lot of negative reactions from the Arabs. And last week, the Brazilian foreign minister was supposed to lead a delegation to visit Egypt. But very abruptly, Egypt canceled this visit. The diplomats in Itamaraty used diplomatic language to say, oh well, the visit was not canceled, it was just postponed. Okay. Now, another question on foreign policy is how is he going to deal with Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua? Venezuela, as you know, is perhaps the most difficult problem in all of Latin America. And I don't think that Brazil is going to join Colombia in any action against Maduro in Venezuela. If anything happens in Venezuela to remove it, Maduro is going to be, I think, the Venezuelan military. Cuba, there's been some negative noises on Cuba. The first thing with Cuba is probably going to eliminate the Mais Médicos, the visiting doctors program of Cuban doctors in Brazil, which is a huge source of foreign reserves for Cuba. Nicaragua, we're not sure exactly how that's going to play out. Nor do the Nicaraguans know how it's going to play out either. Ex-foreign minister, Lula's foreign minister, Celso Amorim, has been preaching against Brazil and against Bolsonaro's government in Europe and in the US. And his preaching has been considered very, very unpatriotic by a lot of Brazilians. He had a very negative CNN interview, and those of you who receive Brazil Focus will receive the link to look at that CNN interview. Is Bolsonaro a threat to Brazilian democracy? This is the theme that has been repeated in the press in Western Europe, in the press here in the US, and also in Latin America. Because he was an army captain who was very insubordinate, he got stuck in the brig several times. And finally was absolved by the STM, the Superior Military Court. What was his insubordination? To lobby publicly and actively in favor of increasing the salaries of army officers. That was considered a no-no, so he got tossed in the brig a couple times. Then after he resigned his commission, he got elected to the Rio City Council and then 6 terms as federal deputy. But not considered a part of the traditional Brazilian political elite. Because of his defense of the military regime and torture, while deputy, and in the heated campaign rhetoric, he was described as autocratic, authoritarian, and pro-military intervention by the international press. Most of the international press, of course, linked to the Brazilian left. Bolsonaro has vowed to adhere to the 1988 Constitution and work with Brazil's political institutions, Congress, the judiciary, public prosecutors, federal police, and federal judges. So what I can say is right now, it doesn't look like a threat to Brazilian democracy, but you never know. We'll have to wait and see whether he ends up being a threat or not. We don't know. Challenges for 2019. Reduce or eliminate the federal fiscal deficit. This is a big task. The fiscal deficit in the states. Rio de Janeiro is the worst. Rio Grande do Sul and Minas Gerais and some other states are running large fiscal deficits. Social Security reform. As you know, this is the major reform which has been on the agenda for a while, especially since Temer was elected, became president after Dilma's impeachment. Our Social Security reform is like a tsunami. The deficit is growing rapidly every year. So this will be a signal to investors that they're waiting for. When Brazil got rid of Dilma, the investors said, great, wonderful, you got rid of Dilma. Now, we're going to see what the new president will do or not do. And they're still waiting to see, because their signal was Social Security reform. If they're able to pass the Social Security reform in the first semester, this will be a signal which will open large new investments by domestic investors and foreign investors for Brazil. And hopefully these new investments will create new jobs and reduce our unemployment. Now the new economy minister, Guedes, of course he's a Chicago boy, he thinks that the Social Security system should go into a capitalization plan, only with the new entrants into the Social Security system, not ex post facto. Capitalization means, as you all know, each Social Security, in quote, investor would have his or her Social Security contribution capitalized by investments, so that when he or she finally retires, his or her Social Security benefit would have been increased by this capitalization scheme. So he hopes that that will be passed for the future. Now, if you have a Social Security reform which puts a lag on retirements, it said men can only retire at age 65, women at age 62. That's pretty low by Western European standards. But also increase the number of years of contribution. So we would have a lag in future retirements for maybe by a few years. So that would help reduce the Social Security deficit. Also, if you have a lot of new jobs created, you would have a lot more people contributing to Social Security under the new, of course, capitalization plan. But that would also help reduce the deficit. So that's the signal that the investors are waiting for. GDP growth, of course, and new job creation. We have had, you might say, small, light GDP growth in 2017, and perhaps more or less 1% this year, perhaps. We'll have to wait and see. Tax reform is another major reform to simplify the tax structure. Reduce the Ministry of Labor to a secretariat. Eliminate side payments by new labor unions. One of the main things, corruption things in the Ministry of Labor was, if you want to register your new labor union, you're going to have to come across with some money, a bribe to get your labor union registered. So they have more or less eliminated that. But the idea is to eliminate the labor ministry, and it would become a secretariat within some other ministry. We're not sure which. Reduce crime and violence. That's very high on the list of priorities as a major public concern. And extradite terrorist murderer Cesar Battisti. I'm sure you all know who he is. He was arrested and convicted and jailed in Italy for having murdered 4 or 5 people. But he was able to escape, went to France, and then had his exile visa canceled in France, and then ended up in Brazil. He was supposed to be extradited by a decision of the Supreme Court, but Lula did not carry it out. So he still remains in Brazil, married a Brazilian woman, has a Brazilian child. But Bolsonaro has said very implicitly to the Italian ambassador, I'll do everything in my power to extradite him back to you guys in Italy. So we'll have to wait and see whether that's going to happen or not. We don't know. Okay, thank you very much. And any questions?
Anything Rostan was gonna.
All right. Thank you, Mauricio. Thank you, the Business Center, for having me. It's always a pleasure to come and join David for these conversations. And it's good because David does all the heavy lifting, right? He does all the other stuff. And I can focus on something much more specific. So I'm glad to be able to build on it. All right, so David mentioned that the fact that these elections were incredibly polarized. Right? One of the things that happened is that as the election got closer and it was a very unpredictable election, what you ended up with was the center caving in. As voters migrated to the polls on the right and on the left, they fed off each other and the fear off each other, and that caused the center to cave. Right, so much so that the major parties in the center, the PSDB, which used to be the major polarizing force of the PT, that they bled a lot of voters. So did Marina Silva, the third place vote getter in the last couple of elections, and a series of other people as well. But one of the things that happens from when you look at not only the numbers, but when you lay those numbers on a map, then that polarization between groups, left and right, also takes a very clear geographic pattern. Looks like that. So if you just tally up the vote, who won, which presidential candidate won in each state. So Brazil looks incredibly polarized, not in a north-south way, but kind of in a diagonal, you know, center, west, south way, and north-northeast way. So if you think about it, even though Bolsonaro won 55% of the vote, he won 16 states, all of the states in the south, all of the states in the southeast, all of the states in the center-west region, and 5 states in the north. The peak was in the state of Acre, for example, or Santa Catarina, where he won almost 3/4 of the vote, actually a little bit over 3/4 of the vote. On the other hand, Haddad, who was the candidate for the PT, or on the left, won all of the 9 northeastern states. And he also won 1 state in the north, actually 2 states in the north, Pará and Tocantins. So the interesting thing is if you look at the votes at the municipal level, and that's what this does, right? It just takes instead of looking at just the whole state, but then it breaks it down by municipality. It doesn't actually change a lot. In fact, Bolsonaro won all of, I want to say, 23 municipalities in the Northeast. That's it. 23 out of, you know, over 1,000 municipalities. So if you look over here, right, there's very few. What this is showing is the continuing of a pattern, right? What this is showing you here is the second round vote in 2014, where Dilma Rousseff barely beat Aécio Neves from the PSDB, and the 2018 second round vote. And this, so what you have here is a continuation of this apparent regional dichotomy in Brazil. Even though you can also see that, you know, compared to the Aécio Neves PSDB vote, what you have here is that Bolsonaro made entrances into the center-west region, into the north region. You know, there's these pockets of support for the right where they used to vote for the PT here, and moving this way. And, you know, what do these regions have in common? You know, they're more agricultural, they're smaller municipalities, they're more remote. Those are the kinds of things that supported Bolsonaro in this way. So if you look at, what this is showing you is the presidential vote since 1998. And what seems to hold there is this pattern that established itself, didn't exist in Fernando Henrique Cardoso's re-election, in Lula's first election, but what the literature has talked a lot about the fact that the PT and the left's support coalition migrated from the more developed south-southeast north. And that pattern has held.
Also not needed.
That's one of the explanations. That's not all the explanations. We're going to get there. Why is it that that's the case? That's one of the things that I'm going to get to in a second. But basically, the polarization that's existing in Brazilian politics is not only partisan, it's not only ideological, but it's regional. Brazil is 2 Brazils. And they've self-selected into supporting 2 different parties. In many ways, what we're going to try to do here today is kind of make sense of why is that the case. Is that the case? Did the PT choose its electoral strategy based on the fact that this was happening? Or is this happening because it chose an electoral strategy? It's a little bit of both. There's an endogeneity here, right? But we're going to talk about, poke some holes on this explanation as well. So basically what this is doing is instead of coloring out the whole municipality, this is a data newspaper in Brazil called Nexo. They do a really good job with data analysis. So instead of just showing you the map, it's showing you where the municipalities actually are and the size of the municipalities. But basically the lesson is the same. The PT does well in the Northeast. Bolsonaro, representing the right, or also the parts that were in the center right, does well in the South and Southeast. This is just taking the Bolsonaro vote and the Haddad vote and putting them in separate maps, right? So it's taking that and just separating them. So what that shows you is that they're almost a mirror image of each other. They don't do well in the same places at displacing other candidates. They compete. And they don't really even compete, like they're catering to different voters. And here, what this map is showing you is the change in vote between the first round and the runoff round, where there are no other candidates, right? And it's basically, the story is, Haddad and the PT made some progress in a few municipalities. The only state in the Northeast that Haddad didn't win, or the PT didn't win in the first round, was Ceará, but that's because they had a presidential candidate. And once he was gone, whether he declared support or not, those people went to Haddad. And Haddad made some gains throughout the country, but Bolsonaro won very few municipalities that he didn't win in the first round. Abandon the presidency for a second and now look at what happened at the governorships, because these were general elections, right? So all of the states also elected governors. There's increased fragmentation as well. So now for the first time, 13 different parties elected a governor. That's the most in Brazilian history. The PT pretty much got beat everywhere else in the country except the Northeast. It elected 4 governors, re-elected 3 that were eligible, and then picked up 1 more in Rio Grande do Norte. Those that were re-elected from the PT had some of the largest margins of any governor in Brazil, so they were incredibly popular. You know, Rui Costa in Bahia, for example, was re-elected with 75% of the vote. Similar numbers in Piauí and in Ceará. And then, but if you look at this, if you forget the noise of all the different parties, and you just looked at who did the gubernatorial candidates say that they were going to side with, the presidential candidates. And here our polarization image shows up again, right? So the northeastern states all backed Haddad, even the ones that were not PT, and all the other regions, save for this little buffer zone right there, they all sided with Bolsonaro. The PT made 2 intertwined decisions as to how it was going to compete for this election. Since it had gotten beaten pretty severely in the municipal elections 2 years ago in the aftermath of the Dilma Rousseff impeachment, it decided that it was going to leverage its political assets. Which ones were they? The number 1 was the image of Lula, the beloved savior of the working class of Brazil. And so they decided to field Lula as a candidate, and David has talked about this a little bit already, even though they knew that very likely he would not be able to run. Ciro Gomes, who's the center-left candidate, gave many interviews where he said that this was an electoral fraud. This was a lie, and this was cheating the Brazilian people because they were promising something that they knew that they couldn't deliver. Lula couldn't be a candidate. Everybody knew that, right? But they did it anyway to try to leverage the image of Lula. And then the moment that the courts decided, as they knew they would, that he wouldn't be able to run, they then transferred Lula to Haddad. So this is right outside the federal police where Lula is incarcerated in Curitiba.
That's a very good picture.
And this is this is by Lula's official photographer. That's why it looks very good. No, of course they're all there. So this is Dilma, right? This is Manuela Dávila, the vice president candidate. This is Haddad. This is Pimentel. He didn't do so well. He was the candidate for the governor of Minas Gerais, and a bunch of other leaders as well.
Limber Frias.
Yeah, Farias is there.
Yeah.
And the moment that they did this, they transferred this image by saying, there's the flag in the back, Haddad is Lula, Lula is Haddad. Right? So this is the way that we're going to try to get, as much as the transfer, leverage this political capital. The signage then brought that, Haddad é Lula, right? Haddad is Lula. Oh, by the way, we also have this other lady called Manuela, but the big thing here is this, right? And this is some of the political media that they put out, the images of literally trying to transfer, or parallels between Haddad and Lula whenever possible. And this is funny because it makes people laugh anywhere else, but the PT thought this was a good idea. Right? So this is in the National Convention where they chose the candidate for the presidency, and everybody thought it was a good idea to literally put Lula's face on Haddad. Like, you can't make this stuff up. Right? And that's why they say, what David mentioned, this idea that Haddad is the poste, or the post, which then later came back to bite him. Right? But this, from the perspective of trying to maximize your assets, makes sense.
Yes.
Right? It's you're under siege. You have political capital that very few other people do, which is an incredibly popular figure, even though they've had some trouble with corruption. And they decided to double down on this. So that was the one thing. And then the other thing that they chose to double down, and again, it double dips because you double down on Lula to then play the regional card, which is Lula's incredibly popular in the Northeast. So now let's cater to the base. They love Lula, and where's the base? The base is in the Northeast. So let's go there. And that's why Haddad is wearing a Lampião hat. If you know anything about Northeastern culture, you know, the famous Northeastern bandits that fought against the established powers. Now, Haddad is not the only one to do this. Everybody worth their salt when they go to the Northeast. They think it's a good idea to put the hat on, or some variation of the hat. Lula, Bolsonaro tried it, but it didn't stick. Aécio Neves tried it. Fernando Henrique Cardoso tried it. He took a lot of flack for doing this, because I think it's the first time he'd ever ridden a horse. It didn't look very good or very natural.
He had to eat bouche du bois.
Yeah, which, you know, I don't know if you guys like to eat goat, but I like to eat goat, but it's an acquired taste. You got, yeah. Fernando Henrique, I don't think I'd ever eaten goat.
When you campaign in New York City, you have to eat all of the regional foods all over the city.
People judge you in New York City whether you know how to fold your pizza or not,
Yes.
right? So it's a similar thing, right? So the other thing is that he campaigned heavily in the Northeast, right? He channeled a lot of this energy, campaigning energy into the Northeast. So I'm going to show you a flurry of images here, but this is his tour, right? So he campaigned in Bahia. He campaigned in Piauí. And this is with Wellington Dias. These are all the powerful governors that were, right? And here's the masks all over again, and then he's doing, I am, you know, we're all those people. In Paraíba.
Paraíba was the only state that elected a woman governor.
Rio Grande do Norte.
Rio Grande do Norte.
Yeah.
Rio Grande do Norte.
And this is in the border between, here he did a double whammy. He did the border between Bahia and Pernambuco, and he got two governors there with him, and he's literally on the bridge here, but the bridge is symbolic, right?
Yes.
Because it's on the São Francisco River, the largest river in the Brazilian Northeast. And one of the policies that Haddad was campaigning on, and again, everybody does this, is to say, you know, we're going to fight very hard to bring back the health of this river, because it's the main source of water in a very arid region, right? On top of this, they were also going to push a series of Northeastern popular policies, which were, you know, strengthening the Bolsa Familia, lowering income taxes for the poorest, income brackets, trying to spur jobs, and a series of other things. Playing up the rights of certain, you know, the importance of certain ministries like national integration, which is the ministry that kind of takes care of all the development programs, fighting drought, all this other kind of stuff that's really important to the Northeast. Here he is in Maranhão with the elected governor from the Communist Party, Flávio Dino. And here he went to see the big statue of Padre Cícero in Ceará. So it's basically, how Northeastern do I have to look? And do I have to put on the hat? Do I need to do the dance? They did the dance. They did the jingles with forró, which is the regional music of the Northeast. And then whenever he could, he also played up the Lula Livre style, right? Lula's a political prisoner. Here he is in Ceará with the governor that was reelected. But he also made some alliances with people who perhaps were not really in with the PT. Like the Calheiros clan in Alagoas. Okay, they were always buddy-buddy with Lula, but the Calheiros was a member of the PMDB, which is the party that betrayed the PT and voted for and made possible the impeachment. So they played many of these, you know, they played ball. So now let's get to the part of the analysis of why they did this, or is this absolutely right that the Northeast is different from the rest? And the first thing that I want to show you is that, okay, so when you look at all those maps, you might think that the Northeast is coherently supporting the PT and it's the new grotão or the pocket of support. But an interesting thing happened. For the first time, the large urban centers in the Northeast, especially the capital cities, supported Jair Bolsonaro. So even though not a lot of municipalities supported Bolsonaro, the large ones did. And this is interesting in a lot of different ways, right? Because historically, the literature and political science that studies Brazil, studies the left in Brazil, says the reason why the PT grew first in urban centers, it's because the only way that they could grow was by latching on to establish civil society. So they needed to develop civil society organizations to latch onto to push this new kind of partisanship. Back when people still believed that they were a party of difference, and some people still do, right? But this puts a chink in that argument, in the armor of that argument, which is, all right, well, then it seems then that where you have organized civil society, where you have relative affluence, higher levels of education, that the Northeast is not voting as a bloc. That made some people scratch their heads, right? So again, these municipalities here were where Bolsonaro won, right? If you look at, there's a lot of stuff going on here, but let me walk you through this. This is a comparison by region and the distribution of the support for Haddad, the vote percentage for Haddad, right? So this is from 0 to 100 here, and it's comparing it to the previous election, which in this case was Rousseff, right? So in every single one of these regions, the Northeast supported Haddad more, or the PT more, but he underperformed Dilma. And that was a close election in every region.
Well, that's a lot. That's
Yeah, in some regions here, by a lot less, right? In the Southeast, in the South, in the Center-West. Now, if you compare per every region, the same thing with Bolsonaro, but this is compared to Aécio Neves, different party, that's why different color. He outperformed Aécio Neves in every region, mostly is, again, in the South, Center-West, and Southeast, but he also performed better in the large urban centers than Aécio Neves did. So there's something happening here underneath. This does the same thing, but instead of looking at regions, looks at municipal size, and it's just re-expressing the idea that we showed you, right? The PT is underperforming in urban centers, so there's something else that's going on here, qualitatively speaking, not just in terms of where is the voter base. Let me jump that. So if you look at not region, but if you look at just each one of these dots is a municipality. And the more to the left we go here, the higher the margin for Haddad, and the more to the right we go here, the more to the margin of Bolsonaro. He won by more. And what this is showing here on the y-axis is the HDI, which is a measure of human development, right? Social development. It takes into account life expectancy, education, and income.
That's the same explanation for the large cities in the Northeast.
Yeah. You know, here but those are the large cities over there. But so basically when you start seeing is that there's a correlation. The lower the level of human development, not just income, but also education and also life expectancy, the more they supported Haddad, right? And the higher levels of human development, the more they supported Bolsonaro. If you break that apart and you look just at poverty, you see that this relationship also goes beyond region. The higher the proportion, the percentage of the population that's in extreme poverty, the higher the support for Haddad, and the inverse relationship. The more poor people that a municipality has, the less they vote for Bolsonaro. And this relationship holds, even if you look at municipalities by region, right? So the relationship between, the extent of poverty and the vote for the PT, holds robust in every single of Brazil's regions. Okay, so maybe it's not about region, maybe it's really about socioeconomic differences. It just so happens that most poor municipalities are in the Northeast.
Yes.
But if you forget the region altogether, and if you lump them together like we did here, that relationship holds regardless. So there's a socioeconomic story here. Why is it that the most developed state in Brazil voted for Bolsonaro, no fears of democratic, retrenchment, all that stuff, in large numbers? And then the interesting thing, and let me see if I get here, this is basically what they cut through all the opinion polls, and they basically showed which are the groups most likely to support Fernando Haddad, and which ones are the groups most likely to support Bolsonaro, right? And not all of these are cultural, some of these are income, some of these are regional, right? So if you are Afro-Brazilian, you're much more likely to support Haddad. If you are not religious, if you're LGBT, if you're Northeasterner, there's overlap between these two things, right? I mean, all of these things. Lower income, no religion, you only completed basic education if you're younger. On the other hand, you have income categories, the richer categories, evangelical religion, center, west, south, men. Right? A couple of this. So it seems to be that what region is capturing is other values, other things.
Why did the Jewish vote go for Bolsonaro?
There's also high variance here, right? So it's difficult to say anything in particular because the confidence interval is so large. So to tell you the truth, I wouldn't know how to answer that off the top of my head.
That's
But
cognizant with the transfer of the embassy.
no.
Oh,
Not necessarily.
Not
I'm not
necessarily.
quite sure. I'm not quite sure about that. But anyway, so here's I want to have three implications that I want to kind of drive a point for you, and I'm going to do this quickly because I know I've already gone over my time. Right? The first thing is, if you've listened to previous talks that I've had here with David and Mauricio, Northeastern politics is about rewarding incumbency. Over most of the states in the Northeast, they rely on federal transfers for most of their budget, more than 50% of their budget. So they're used to playing incumbent politics called governismo or situacionismo. More often than not, governors realign. Now, the problem that they've painted themselves into a corner is they've been hung out to dry because they all sided with the PT and the PT lost national. So now they're exposed. Historically, every time this happened, governors realigned. Right? That's what I've shown here in the past. Now they're hanging out to dry. And they don't know what's going to happen. Is Bolsonaro going to punish them? Is Bolsonaro then going to stop updating for inflation, Bolsa Familia, and all these other kinds of things? We don't know, but people are scared. Right? What is the PT going to learn from this? Did it learn its lesson that it upset a bunch of people and it damaged its brand? Or did they say, you know what, we barely lost to a guy that, all things considered, the economy was bad, there was all these other kinds of things, so really what we have to do is double down, which is what they did in the first round. Right, to bad results for the rest of Brazil. I wish I knew, but in the Northeast, especially in the states where they won, I think that they'll double down. I don't think that they're going to do a lot of soul searching. And the last thing is, previously, and this goes with the alignment story, what's going to happen in the municipal election in 2 years? This is what we're really going to know what's going to happen here. If the PT is going to bleed and wither to death, or if they're going to use the Northeast to reconquer the national level. And this all has to do with the fact that we have no idea what Bolsonaro is going to do, right? A very famous reporter in Brazil called it the Kinder Egg government. It's beautiful, it's tasty, but you don't know what you're going to get. You got to open it up and you got to look to see which kind of toy you're going to get. Right? It could be anything. If Bolsonaro does well, my prediction, and again, this is coherent with my research and what I presented here in the past, I think mayors will realign and they'll hurry under the federal umbrella and they'll hurt the governors. But if he doesn't, then the preeminence stays at the state level. And then we'll see more of what we saw now, which is governors, where the PT governs, it'll remain strong. Right? But it's really, really early. We have no idea of knowing. We don't know if he's going to go to the right, go anti-system, or if he's going to normalize. We have no idea. Right? But the Northeast is exposed. It's an asset that the PT played very hard. It cost them the national election because they doubled down on trying to stay there. And now the big thing is, will the Northeast now pay for this? I think they will, a little bit. And I think things will get a little scarier, a little worse before they get better. But again, that's opinion/analysis. Thank you very much.
We'll have to wait and see because we really don't know what Bolsonaro is going to do. As Jorge said, what is he going to do to the Northeast, which is hanging out to dry? Whether he's going to chastise the region, give differential support to certain things in the region or not. So we don't really know yet what Bolsonaro is really going to do. As I said, it looks like he's going to put together a reasonably strong support coalition in Congress. But we'll only be able to see that after the 1st of February when the new Congress takes office. As everyone knows, he made some very, very strong statements in the past about military regime, in favor of torture, in favor of the army taking over Brazil again, etc. But now that looks more like campaign rhetoric, given his stances that he's taken in the past few days. But we don't really know whether that's going to be carried out or not. In terms of what he asked about taxation, referring to the Bolsa Familia, Bolsonaro already said we're going to tack on the 13th wage to Bolsa Familia. So Bolsa Familia will get an extra 13th month allocation, which would be like a nice Christmas present, because the 13th wage is paid in December at the end of the year. He's also referred to a possible change in income tax brackets where the initial level of taxation would be raised, maybe up as high as 5 minimum wages, where there will be no income tax on these lower income tax brackets. But that's not enough. There has to be a rearrangement of the whole tax structure, which is considered very, very complicated. Most businesses in Brazil spend only about a third of their profits with employees who the only thing they do is organize how we're going to pay the company's income taxes. So the whole tax structure in Brazil is considered to be extremely complex and very, very difficult. And so one of the ideas is to simplify the whole tax structure. No country does a tremendous overall tax reform all at once. They do bits and pieces. Of course, Trump did a major tax reform favoring the more wealthy Americans, as you all know. His problem now is trying to keep people in line in terms of what they're saying publicly. Some people have suggested that he should immediately appoint a press spokesman, or spokesperson, I'm sorry, to try to get all of these comments in line, in one line of comments, where his economy minister has talked out of turn several times and had to be corrected by Bolsonaro. And so he has this problem of trying to keep all of the comments from the various future ministers more or less in line. Now, the vice president, General Mourão, was maligned by Haddad quite badly because this musician from Bahia came out and said, this guy, General Mourão, he tortured me back in 1969. And then Haddad used this in his campaign. But then it came out that General Mourão in 1969 was only 16 years old. And he got into the army only in 1972. Now, he did a very interesting interview with BBC, General Mourão, and demonstrated that he has a fairly good capacity in English, and was interviewed in English by the BBC. Of course, Bolsonaro's capacity in English is zero. And so the general is not just your average Brazilian general. He has some abilities and capabilities. And every once in a while he speaks out and says certain things. And so we don't have a single line voice coming out of the Bolsonaro.
Good, you had it there.
If I understood your question correctly, it was whether do you think Bolsonaro will take a strong hand, a strong interest in governing, or if he will be happy to let his team and his cabinet govern in which ways they're going to go. So Paulo Guedes, for example, in a strong neoliberal type of policy, and Moro in justice and all those things. Did I understand your question correctly? Yes, even though he has a history of being corporatist and statist. Yeah. Again, I'm going to go back to the Kinder Egg thing, which is, I thought it was beautiful. When I heard it, I was like, wow, this person deserves a prize. Because the thing is, we absolutely don't know. During the American campaign, in Trump's case, and I don't like to make these analogies too much, because I don't think they're very good parallels of each other. Just people latch onto them, but I don't think they're good apples and apples type of comparison. But everybody thought or hoped that Trump had a lot of rhetoric, but then he was going to go to the center when he had to govern, right? That didn't happen. Turns out he did exactly what he said he was going to do, which in some ways it's promising and then delivering what the electorate voted for. In Bolsonaro's case,
you get what you deserve,
right? Or what you ask for, right?
You answer right.
In Bolsonaro's case, it's interesting because everything he has said since the election has been much more toned down. Much more responsible, I hate that word, but much more tame in terms of, oh, I actually will have to govern this country. And deferring, and so Guedes has had more say in terms of economic policy. I think he's going to Chile, no surprise, right? Chile, both Guedes and Bolsonaro have praised the Pinochet government for what they've done in terms of economic reforms and all that other kind of stuff. So it's all symbolic of that, I think, right? We don't really know. I've read some interesting things from, for example, in America's Quarterly, Brian Winters, who's the editor-in-chief there, who spent a lot of time interviewing Bolsonaro. He said, I think he's going to try to go down this more estadista route, this more govern responsibly route. But I think the moment he hits the first wall, that's what we're going to see. Is he going to go back to his old way, which is more authoritarian, less plural type of way? Or is he going to settle down and let people govern, right? Guedes doesn't seem to have those sensibilities.
What do you think Bolsonaro's position is going to be on the Paris climate change agreement? And do you think that you deregulate the environmental laws, and what impact will that have on the rainforest deforestation?
Yes, sir, you had your hand up? Yes.
Income distributions in Brazil and the United States are very positive this year. Most of the people have low income, and a smaller number of people have higher income. You said that the vote of Haddad was mainly from people with lower income, and vice versa for Bolsonaro. How is it that he invited Bolsonaro won the popular vote, with many more people being lower income than upper income? Was there any kind of voter suppression? Is it the fact that low income people vote at a much lower rate than middle income? Could you explain that situation for me? One other question is, the people with lower income in southern parts of Brazil, do they, for example, do they vote at a lower rate than, let's say, the people with lower incomes in the north part?
Yes, I think that's an important sub-question, the concentration of poverty in the Northeast. That was high, Mario.
I think this is connected, but if you look at the distribution of votes in the South, which is essentially white population, Euro population, and you keep moving up and you find essentially urban areas which are effectively more controlled by Brancos in the community. And I hate to say race in that, but certainly there's some connection between the distribution of votes as you go urban, rural, north, south. Santa Catarina, I think, is roughly 5% black population as opposed to a European population.
5.
Let me just finish one thing. In a sense, this kind of white privilege issue at a time when Afro-Brazilians and other groups are pressuring for greater rights seems almost in some ways a reaction to that pressure, and a suggestion that this is, in a sense, the white privilege regaining power.
You want to build up on that question?
I want to add.
You want to add to that question?
I want to add to this
It's
question.
a friendly addition to his question. Very good.
Well, it's another question, but it's related. Is this the second hallucinatory experience that I've had discussing the Brazilian elections? Because we were down there just before the elections, and our friends, who are university people, were terrified, planning to leave the country. And really, the feelings against Bolsonaro were very, very, very strong. So this all seems like a very calm and quiet.
I agree. It's amazing.
What's going on. And so, what I think about his incitements, Bolsonaro's incitements to racism, incitements to persecution of, that's right, homophobia and LGBTQ people, to his lack of care for indigenous people, to his lack of care for people who are in...
All right, let's turn that into question.
Yes, and aren't these remarks likely to incite a violence of their own? So,
George, you want to answer part of the
Yeah,
question?
start.
Sure. Just real quick, I'll try to be as fast as I can.
Yeah.
Okay, so the thing with income distribution, aren't there more poor people than rich people in Brazil? Obviously, yes. The thing is, we set the bar for middle class in Brazil really, really, really low. And it turns out that the moment you moved from the two lowest economic classes to the what we would call the beginnings of the middle class in Brazil, those people were supporting Bolsonaro more.
Which percentile of this are you, right?
But classes C and right and D even. So anything over a couple of minimum wages,
The cutoff
which is
was 2 minimum wages.
right, so
Above 2
much
minimum
lower
wages,
than you think
they
here.
supported Bolsonaro.
They supported Bolsonaro more in the south and southeast, even in the poorest neighborhoods. So, for example, in the favelas in Rio, they voted for Bolsonaro. Perhaps not for the same reasons. Perhaps because he's also the law and order guy, supposedly to fight against crime and homicide rates, which are higher in Brazil and in many urban areas than anything. So I think the income thing, it's hard to say which proportion of the poorer voters in each municipality did that, because we don't have that fine data yet. But so that's why people were using, the stuff that I was showing you was proportion of poverty in the municipalities. That's the best thing we have right now. But we don't have the data to actually answer your question with a very fine-grained point. But in the southern and southeastern cities, the poorer regions, or the poorer classes, and just above poverty line, they were supporting Bolsonaro. Is that a backlash to identity politics? White privilege? Absolutely, I think so. The business classes, the middle classes that saw the poor come closer to them, were scared. And we're feeling that sense of like the middle classes in the rich world backlash against globalization type of thing.
But you had, you had a lot of upward social mobility during Lula's period, and these people had just moved up.
Yeah, and then the goalposts move, right? They're not happy with what they were before, and now they're mad at other things. But I think there's a backlash element there too, absolutely. And then this whole thing of, I thought that was an interesting thing, because I don't know how to reply to the fact that we don't seem scared of. Well, first of all, it's been a few weeks, and I've had a few drinks after the election to kind of take that edge off. But the other thing is, I don't know if ideological fervor and fear is going to help us make sense of this thing. I think right now that is the thing, that's what we have, and what we're trying is to make sense of how in trouble are we, or what's the future for Brazil. So that's what we're trying to do. So I don't know, in the sense I take a little bit of offense to I'm not scared enough. I'm scared plenty as a citizen and as a political scientist. But what I'm trying to do is take that stuff out and try to make sense of some of it for you guys and me. I don't know what you have to say about that, David.
Well, we are going to stay with those topics for quite a while.
Well, my
By the way,
answer to your question.
David,
Sure.
may I add something? To me, one of the most striking aspects of this whole turmoil in Brazil, this whole turning point, is Rio and Minas Gerais, two states that voted PT to a very large extent before. This time they voted Bolsonaro, big time.
Big time.
Big time.
I mean, Minas Gerais is an amazing, it's the second largest state in Brazil.
And defeated Dilma running for the Senate.
Defeated Dilma, defeated the PSDB guy,
And the PT guy.
and then got the novel guy, governor.
Right.
It's an amazing thing.
That's a state and a president type of backlash in Minas, right? Because the Pimentel, the governor in Minas, had by all measures a horrible. It's the only place where the PT candidate ran for re-election and lost, right? So there's a state level story in Minas as well as a national story.
Then the Rio de Janeiro story is an amazing one.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't heard anyone address that question, but we'll do that later. But David, you want to?
Answer your question about the universities, and I'll answer it from a personal family background. Our daughter is a professor at the University of Brasilia. She was extremely incensed and very, very apprehensive now as to what's going to happen with Bolsonaro. The universities in Brazil generally, let's talk about the federal universities, the public universities, are generally more to the left than the average norm in Brazil. And so most professors and a lot of students at federal universities were very favorable to the PT and to the PT candidate. And there was a lot of alarmism. I'm going to have to leave Brazil, I'm going to be persecuted, et cetera, et cetera. That was the immediate reaction the day after the election, the day after. That continues, but the hue and cry of I'm going to have to leave the country has subsided. And a lot of them are now waiting to see what is really going to happen. But you're right, the emotions on the part of most people at federal universities were quite strong. And our daughter was very, very harsh on her two parents, that you cannot ever, ever vote for Bolsonaro. If you do, I will be ashamed of you. You know how children are. And our son also was quite strong as well.
Right.
I can tell you some other family stories from other families.
No, we'll say a little later. We'll take another round of 3 questions.
About the environment.
Yeah, the environment is
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, the environment.
the environment is a very interesting question. Bolsonaro had made some noises about leaving the Paris Agreement, as Trump did. But it now looks like perhaps not. However, the press yesterday and today said that his 2 sons, one who was elected federal deputy in Sao Paulo, the other was elected senator from Rio, these 2 sons have been now making some noises about the problems of defending the environment. Whether this will lead to more deforestation in the Amazon, I'm not sure. In the Amazon region, the people who are trying to repress deforestation have been abused and have been shot at, beaten, et cetera, in some of these places in the North region. And so the federal police and the federal national force has been called in to reinforce the people trying to protect the environment. That's in the last few weeks. Whether that will continue or not, we're going to have to wait and see, because...
But there are statements about using the Amazon for economic development.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very strong.
Right.
Motor and the
Likely more deforestation, right? Likely more.
Perhaps, yes. Deforestation has a lot to do with economics. When Brazil was in a recession in 2015 and 16, the deforestation declined tremendously because of the money question. When you have stronger GDP growth, you have more deforestation, unfortunately.
Anti-corruption is a great way to win elections in Latin America, but given that you then need to use the corrupt state to fight against it, it's usually a terrible governing strategy, or it often has lots of unforeseen consequences. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit about how the anti-corruption campaign would translate into government, and if there's any possibility that it'll actually bite him in, kind of turn against him.
A lot of questions. Rafael, you already asked one. Wait a minute.
Well, nobody answered of those, so I wanted to just throw out the fact that nobody answered my question. Thank you.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, just to restate, so, I mean, kind of sharing a little bit of the hallucinatory aspect, it seems like it's electoral politics, a surprising election, but just electoral politics. I think a lot of people in Brazil that I know, and just in general, would see the democratic rupture as happening a couple of years ago, that a kind of alliance got together to throw out Dilma Rousseff with very little basis for that, and then to undercut the favorite presidential nominee and put him in jail so that you can run. And so they would see this as a kind of fruition of a democratic rupture that already happened. How do you see those critiques? And also related to this other question, where is Operation Car Wash now that its champion is in the government?
Yes.
Building on those two, I recall that there was an article in the London Review of Books, academically oriented, talking about all the difficulties that the PT was having with Dilma and etc. But what struck me in this very long article, there was no mention about the negative public reaction to the World Cup and the building of all of those stadiums, which seems to have been connected to corruption. And then the people said, we need hospitals, we need schools, we need public transportation. And I was surprised that the academics, maybe because Lula was a saint, they weren't going to go into that, because to say anything would be to be anti-PT.
The whole corruption thing, Bolsonaro has said quite strongly that the anti-corruption investigation in the car wash will go ahead. And of course he brought Sergio Moro into his government and gave him all these extra powers. So I think the whole car wash thing will continue. Lula has 4 or 5 other accusations and cases pending, not only in Curitiba, but also in Brasilia and in Sao Paulo. So Lula may be sentenced to more prison terms in the next few months. We're not sure. And other people from the PT, MDB, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with corruption is endemic within the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. We have maybe 100 or 130 or 40 deputies who have accusations. Not only corruption accusations, but actually accusations as bad as murder. But they're protected by something called the foro privilegiado, which says you can only be tried by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is not a penal court and has great difficulty trying these cases. So it's possible that the Supreme Court may remove this foro privilegiado, then everyone, deputies, senators, etc., will be tried by first-level federal and state courts. That's possible. But the whole corruption thing, going back to the stadiums, was tremendous for the World Cup in 2014. And these were mostly state governments allied with construction companies. The stadium they built in Brasilia had 100% cost overrun. It was more or less budgeted at a little less than 1 billion reais, but it cost over 2 billion. And that happened in all the other states.
Is it used a lot?
Huh?
Is it used a lot?
Well, that's many of these stadiums became white elephants. You build a huge soccer stadium in Manaus. Manaus doesn't even have a Class D soccer team. So you have this stadium that's just now a total white elephant. What do you do with it? Ours has been used in Brasilia for some sports events and a lot of rock concerts and other things, which do bring in some income. But now they're going to privatize by concession the administration of the stadium. So it won't draw too much out of the federal funds, the funds in our government in Brasilia. But in other states, the stadiums just became white elephants with no use at all, unfortunately. Now, going back to your point about the conspiracy of ousting Dilma for no reason at all, which is not the case. They never refer to Collor, who was impeached for no reason at all also. The PT never mentions Collor in his impeachment as any comparison to Dilma. Dilma neglected the Congress. One deputy from the PT said, she never called me up at all. Now, last week she called me twice to try to help against her impeachment. So by neglecting Congress, that's one of the reasons why she was impeached. But she had the other problems, of course, with the budget falsifications, etc. That eliminated her. Now, Lula got put in jail because he violated some laws. And in a country where you have laws and you have courts that uphold the laws, there was no other alternative than for him to be convicted in the first level court and then this confirmed by the second level court. So in Brazil's legal framework and laws, he had to go to jail because the Supreme Court decided if you are convicted at a second level court, you go straight to jail. In Brazil, in the US, if you're convicted at a first level court, you go straight to jail. There was this most powerful congressman, Roszkonkowski, I don't know if you remember his story, a Polish guy elected by the Polish voters in a district outside of Chicago. This first level federal judge in Chicago, woman, sent him straight to jail with no bail. And the Brazilians said, how could that happen? Why wasn't he tried by the US Supreme Court? Why didn't he have bail, go out on bail to defend himself? No way. The Supreme Court doesn't decide those things. And the judge said, no bail, you go straight to jail. And the Brazilians just couldn't believe it. How did this happen to this person? Because the legal system in the two countries are quite different. But in Brazil we have these laws, and I'm sorry to say that when these laws are broken, these people go to jail. Not only did Lula go to jail, but several others from the PT, MDB, PP, PTB, PR also were convicted and sentenced to jail as well.
And
what they did, excuse me?
And businessmen.
Yes, and businessmen as well. We had a consortium of about 20 construction companies that ripped off Petrobras. They almost destroyed Petrobras, our largest corporation in Brazil, which was one of the jewels in the crown and the pride of all Brazilians is Petrobras. They almost destroyed Petrobras in the process. But there was a lot of other corruption in other areas, not just Petrobras. Lula was in the process in Brasilia of selling MPs. MPs are medidas provisórias. So you sell these for quite a high price, and the MP benefits firm X, Y, or Z. That's another type of corruption. So corruption was not just Lava Jato and Petrobras, but there are a lot of other types of corruption going on as well. Whether corruption will be eliminated altogether, probably not. But I think the whole initiative, anti-corruption initiative, will continue. We're not sure how far it will go, but it will continue. And Bolsonaro has supported its continuation.
Can I just real quick? So I'm going to try to answer put together all the corruption questions together and then throw it into the rupture with democracy, right? So the first thing is, picking up on David's point that there's always corruption, right? If you're going to call foul on Dilma, you have to call foul on Collor. That's the point that Kurt Whalen made a long time ago, which is Collor, there's always corruption in Brazil. It's a matter of when do they get called on it. Now, so if you use the work, for example, of Aníbal Pérez Linan, who works on impeachments or whenever presidents don't finish their terms, believe it or not, corruption is not one of the variables that he highlights. But I had to check my notes here to make sure that I'm doing it justice. He talks about whenever there's broad social mobilization, whenever there's media coverage, which in this case there was of all the scandals and all the other stuff. And then the nail in the coffin is when you lose congressional support. And if you look at those three issues, with corruption in the background and the economy also cratering in the background, that's when you had the sufficient conditions to have an impeachment or an impeded government, which works not only in Brazil, but
like with Collor, exactly.
Yeah, with Collor, but also in other Latin American countries, right? So yes, corruption. Much easier to run a campaign on corruption than it is to govern. Now, so what did Bolsonaro do? He also picked, I think the Moro appointment and the Guedes appointment in the economy are the same strategy, which is I don't have a lot of legitimacy. Nobody knows what I'm going to do. So what I'm going to do is buy legitimacy and
acquire.
Buy meaning acquire, not with money, but just borrow it, right? In the Thomas Schelling way, which is how do you get credibility when you don't have it? So he appointed two super ministers, Guedes in the economy, the neoliberal guy, and then Moro, the corruption guy. Yeah. This is good in the short term because then it gets, I guess, some people to say, I give him a little time. But the problem is these people aren't fireable. If he fires Moro, or if he fires Guedes, I think Guedes is easier to fire than Moro.
Probably, yes.
But then his credibility goes out the window. And then we get stuck with a president who doesn't know how to govern, or was never governed before, or, and all this other kind of stuff, and then we're in trouble. Now, so I think we absolutely are in a process of somewhat democratic retrenchment in Brazil, but I think it's more in terms of violation of democratic norms, respect for minority rights, equality, all those other kinds of things. There have been fewer actual violations of rules. But, as everybody knows, democracy is not just about rules, it's about norms, right? Most of what it is about norms of coexistence, of sharing power, of respecting the value of opposition, and all those things. And I think those things are being violated daily. And it's allowing certain people at the extremes to then say, hey man, if the president of Brazil says that, then I can take this into my own hands and nothing will happen to me.
That's what happened.
I think
that's what happened in the U.S.
Yes, same thing as here. So I think the Brazilian democracy is not in a good, healthy stage. No, it's not. I think though institutions haven't been violated directly yet, but they very well might.
Be.
But it's too early to call. It's too early to say, right? I mean, we can't say that yet because it hasn't happened yet. Can we be scared that it might happen? Sure.
Meanwhile, let's go into the last cycle of questions. Let me start by saying, meanwhile, we do know that the PSDB and the PT are really hurt badly, right? When both parties, the PSDB is social democrat, the PT more to the left. So I mean, for the time being, it would seem that both the left and the middle, the social democratic way, are really not getting a lot of support in Brazil.
Yeah, who paid for the post-impeachment scandal? It was the PSDB paid and the PMDB paid from the center. They got beat much more. They paid for those crimes much more than the PT did because the PT still has, the largest bancada in the Câmara, and they still have governors, and they still have a lot of, but the PMDB hurt a lot, and the PSDB hurt a lot.
I showed the reduction.
So what that suggests is that then the alternative that is supporting a more liberal solution, rumo, caminho, to the direction for Brazil, really gain considerable support, or is gaining considerable support. We'll see what happens. But let me pose a question. And then let me say that the question of democracy, I think another way of saying this is, and I don't mean to sound, because I'm supporting the conservatives, that Brazilian democracy has not yet had to face a strong conservative movement, and now it has. So the challenge for democracy is it strong enough to do something with this and absorb it somehow? And that's a challenge. I don't know how it will happen, but it's real. What I hear from this data and my own data is that support is real. I mean, Bolsonaro did well in his visit to Brasilia last week. This week he's going next week. His appointments were well received. I don't hear a lot of mobilization against him. No massive movements against him in the street. I don't think they're there. So that's a question, and also a statement of opinion. But
I have two quick questions. One is the U.S. press talked about the influence of Steve Bannon on the, let's say, the structure of Bolsonaro's campaign, and I'm wondering, one, if you would comment on that, and two, if you think that his influence will continue as Bolsonaro installs himself. And secondly, if you all had a crystal ball, how do you see the Brazilian economy a year from today in terms of this very conservative guy having been elected?
My question would be, given that the Congress currently has about 30 different parties, to what extent do you think that the other parties would be able to compromise Bolsonaro's agenda to a least extreme policy book, to what extent do you think they would be able to bring his views to a more moderate rhetoric, giving his need to compromise with so many different coalitions and parties and political fronts?
The question of the political parties, as I showed in my chart, will probably, the number of parties will be reduced in the chamber and probably to a certain extent reduced in the Senate as well. But putting a governing coalition together means that you have to more or less accommodate what these parties are interested in. And that's what's called governing. The Brazilian president has two sets of chips on his table to bargain. One is federal appointments. Brazil has about 23,000 federal appointments to make, which are very coveted by deputies and senators. Some of Bolsonaro's people have said, we're going to reduce that way down. And the other set of chips are budget amendments that deputies and senators have put into the budget. So when you release these budget amendments, you get the support of the author of this budget amendment. Steve Bannon has had some contacts with Bolsonaro and his people, but they have been, I think, inflated and overestimated. This guy left Washington and is now operating with the conservative parties in Western Europe with not too much success. So he's had some contacts with Bolsonaro and his people, but not that much. Now, the nervousness of women in this room, which was mentioned by Mauricio, is that initially it looked like in the polls that the women were going to vote against Bolsonaro. But then the polls showed that he had about 45% of women supporting him, which is more than Haddad had. Now, the polls some of the polls are broken down. Datafolha and also Ibope are broken down by categories, by age groups, by gender, by religious groups, by income groups, etc. And as Jorge said, if you look at the breakdown by income, once you get above 2 minimum wages, you're Bolsonaro. And once you're below the 2 minimum wages, you're Haddad and the PT. So regionally, he sort of told us that it's not totally regionally, that there are these social categories, income and levels of education. Why did 42 cities in the Northeast vote for Bolsonaro? Because I was asked that by a Brazilian journalist, a question. I said, well, these cities don't have much Bolsa Família, and these cities have higher levels of education and income. And the journalist said, that's it, you don't have to answer anymore. So you have these other variables other than region, which are very important in Brazil. Why do you have lower income people in the south and the southeast voting for Bolsonaro? Why do you have a state like São Paulo where you have Alckmin, a lackluster, sane charisma, no charisma candidate?
But a great guy.
Great guy, yes, but was governor of São Paulo for 4 times. And Bolsonaro comes in and then the polls show that Bolsonaro wins the state of São Paulo. I mean, how can you put this guy into being your candidate for president? That's the question about reorganizing the PSDB. A lot of leaders in the PSDB got wiped out. So that party's going to have to sit down and do massive reorganization. Whether the PT is going to have the courage or the interest in reorganizing its party, we're not sure. The PT went against a Brazilian tradition. The tradition in Brazil is that if you elect less mayors, 2 years later you're going to elect less deputies. In 2016, the PT elected less than half of the mayors that it elected in 2012. So the rationale was, by this rule of thumb, PT is going to elect only 30 deputies, but they elected 56. So that didn't work. So we're not sure whether the PT is going to sit down and reorganize itself or not. Now the PT is under duress. A lot of people have, well, opposition, you have a democracy, opposition has to function as an opposition. But Ciro Gomes has come in and said, I'm organizing an opposition bloc with the PDT, the PSB, and the PCdoB. And we're not going to include the PT in our opposition coalition. So PT is not part of this opposition group, which maybe has 80 deputies, has more than the PT has. So even the opposition is now divided into 2 groups. Ciro Gomes wants to be the candidate for president in 2022, and he's already in the campaign. It was mentioned about what did he do in the second round. He did nothing. He escaped to Paris for most of the second round, came back to Ceará to vote on the Friday before the second round election. And Haddad was hopeful that he was going to be endorsed by Ciro Gomes. Ciro Gomes, instead of endorsing him, pounded the PT because he thinks the PT did a great disservice to him during the campaign. So he is extremely anti-PT. Now what is Ciro Gomes doing? He's trying to attract the PSDB into his group for this adventure in 2022, which is Brazil's bicentennial of independence.
Okay, so let me see if I can do this real quick. I think the Bannon connection and the Trump connection, I think they're more affinitive than they are actual. I doubt that either of them played a very large role. I think that they've absorbed a lot of the language. Fake news, like my father said to me, fake news. My father doesn't speak English. And I'm like, what the, you know, so these things, it's like globalization, right? It's like cultural globalization. That stuff gets absorbed. And that's why the role of the American president is very important, but not just in what you can make people do, but what other people choose to do because they've seen you do it. So I don't know how much of a role. I think right now they're happy to be aligned with each other. I think Bolsonaro wants to be closer to the United States more so than any government recently in Brazil has been. But I don't know. I think the first time you put Bolsonaro and Trump together in the room, they might love each other. But then the moment that the nationalism is going to clash, right? So I don't really know how it's going to be. In terms of economic reforms and how hard it's going to get, and will the economy be better next year than now? I think there's 2 pulls in 2 different directions. First of all, I feel really weird talking to Bob about this because you literally wrote the book on crucial needs, weak incentives, right? And that's the thing. That's why democratic governments don't want to do tough reforms. So likely they're not going to want to do it. But I think we've backed ourselves into a corner, Brazil, that if you don't do it, it's going to explode. I think on the other side, so that would have a negative effect of austerity, right? It would hurt. It would be very unpopular. People wouldn't want to do it. The other thing, though, is to the extent that I have any read on financial markets, I think people have been holding to invest.
Holding back, right?
They've been holding back to see what would happen. And because of this irrational marriage with Bolsonaro, oh no, let's believe because he's not the left, therefore he must be pro-market. He's saying all the right things. He hired the right person. I think in the beginning we're going to have a wave of people jumping, eager to invest. And I think that might give us a little boost. But I think just like what we're seeing in Argentina with Macri, the market will turn very quickly. The moment you do something that they don't like, they'll hurt. They'll punish you in the way that they're punishing. They said all the right things about Macri, and Macri is now suffering and having to go to the IMF. So I think the market is going to give him a little bit of a honeymoon because he's not Lula. So that might have a little bit of a positive effect in the short term, but austerity would probably bring it down. I don't know. It all depends on how much of a honeymoon will the Brazilian people give Bolsonaro. And I think the interesting thing is that in Brazil, unfortunately, and this is more of a reason to panic and feel really depressed, there's no gerrymandering to blame it on. There's no electoral college to blame it on. There's no popular vote to blame it on. Bolsonaro, whether you like it or not, put his finger on the zeitgeist. And that scares the crap out of me, right? In my family, in cities, in Brazil, in all that stuff. People feel this thing that he's representing. That's why he's been able to run this campaign in WhatsApp with no money. Because people are feeling that stuff. He's riding this wave. He's not causing this wave. So maybe he'll get a little bit of a honeymoon because people really believe and they're like, all right, that's what we're going to get, and never the PT again, and this is great. But the prospects that this can all fall apart quickly and so horribly are huge. We'll see. I want to be wrong. Maybe I want to be wrong that the fact that we're all scared because we're lefty academics, maybe it'll work. But I think all the tools that we have seem to think that we're on a tightrope that will fall.
Well, a lucha continua.
Well, let me,
Any parting words?
yeah, on the economy, as Jorge said, investors are
You've
waiting
lived
to
in Brazil
see.
since 1962, Jorge, rapaz.
Yes, George. Okay, George. Jorge. So, if we're going to have a massive influx of investments, domestic and international, especially after the signal is given on the Social Security reform in the first semester,
Yeah.
this influx of huge investments is going to stimulate the economy and create new jobs.
That man has
So
to-
probably 2019 will have larger GDP growth than in 2018. 18 is going to be about 1%. The forecast is maybe 2.5% next year. So we'll have to wait and see whether that's going to happen or not. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see.
Well, excellent presentation. Thank you. Thank you.